work did not account for a large percentage of what I was doing by the end, right? Like there was certainly some of it, and it was, it was productive, but there was also a bunch of things I had to do every day, which were legitimately, 5-minute tasks or 10-minute tasks. And it was like, hey, you have to reply to this email. You have to like look at this thing that person sent you and give them a quick note, right? Like you have to, do expense reports or admin stuff. And, all that stuff was not deep work. I also, even when I was working full time, working from home, and I still am working full time, but when I was on a more rigid schedule and beholden to other people's schedules, what I found was that I could, if I really needed to get something in the middle of the day, whether or not it was sort of practicing music or swimming or like exercise, the most critical time to get it done was the first 5 minutes after my last thing ended, right? Because if I let myself sit there, check email, check messenger, check work chat, I would get sucked into something. But if as soon as my last meeting ended, I got up and just like headed for the pool or headed for the drum set, then it was much easier to get it in and then kind of like come on back and be ready for my next thing.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Yeah. I mean, so you don't let it too much thinking happen between those 5 minutes and just like move on to the
That's right.
next thing.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah, I think that's great. And I mean, I sometimes kind of fall into the same traps. So I'm going to try that one out as well. Um, Switching gears a little bit, you have worked in a variety of different teams across like large tech companies and startups. What did you find were like the differences and similarities in these teams in at startups or at large tech companies?
Uh, yeah, that's interesting. So the one of the things that I would say was really different, it depended on the company, right? But like, uh, there, uh, there was often a real disparity in agreement on how work was done, right? And so you and I would probably call it process, right? What my most starkly, when I went from Amazon, which for good reasons, I would describe as having not necessarily a heavy process culture, but like at least a fairly consistent way of doing business. And I came to Meta, and I started working with you, right? We were working together on Assistant. I remember really early on, I think going to you or and just being like, I don't understand what's happening here. Like this feels like chaos, right? Like it's not clear how anything's getting done. It's not clear sort of what the rituals are. It just feels like everything is super organic in the way it's getting created. And I think part of that was like the state we were with the team, right? It was a really early team. It wasn't clear how long it was going to be around. We had no products live, right? And so it was almost a startup-y ish figuring out what rituals worked and what didn't. That experience ended up being super useful when I then went to Zwift, where I was the chief product officer, because it was another organization that, had some rituals, had some process, wasn't clear a lot of times why the process existed. And so, I would walk into meetings and observe and sort of leave and say, well, I'm not really sure what we got out of that. Right. And I would ask sort of other people, hey, does this seem like something that's working? And they say, oh, no. It's something we started 2 years ago because the leader at the time liked it, but the audience has changed and the process has changed. And we just keep doing it, you know, because it gets us all together. And so over the course of a year, we sort of went through and curated and figured out what processes worked and what didn't, which I think is actually, part of what gets missed sometimes at big companies, right? It's like it was not always the energy to examine the processes once they'd been put in place and say, hey, are these still working for us? Are they the right things? Are they not the right things? Sometimes we did, right? Like sometimes at the end of the half you'd look and you say, hey, is this still working? Is this something we have to do? But sometimes you would find yourself kind of continuously doing the thing that was just not providing value anymore, but you couldn't stop doing it because no one could take the time and effort to like figure out how to make it better, right?
Mhm.
And it takes real time, right? It takes actual brain power to sit in there and say, let's inspect and let's figure out what parts of this are working and what aren't. And we have to go do stakeholder interviews and we have to ask questions that maybe we haven't asked in a long time. Like, is this providing you value, right? Is this artifact or this thing we're doing useful? And if it's not, like, maybe we should stop doing it. My I don't know if it's favorite, but at one thing at Zwift when I was scaling up to managing a much larger team is I had these sort of like I had this like extended staff meeting, right? And in my head, it was a meeting where it was my directs and then the senior members of their team. So a reasonably large group, 15,
Mhm.
20 people. And it was supposed to be, a place where we sort of shared information and collaborated and had kind of this like group um almost like team of purported experts in the company to help think through big problems. But
Mhm.
that's never what it was, right? And I don't know if I set the agenda wrong or I didn't ask for enough help, but it usually just ended up being 45 minutes of me talking, right? And like various people on my staff sometimes engaging, but a lot of it was just me talking. And so after a couple months, I sort of said, hey, I'm going to cancel this because I don't always feel like it's a good use of time. But I said I won't hold you to account now. But if any of you feel like this is missing, right? If after not having it for a couple weeks, you guys feel like there's something missing, like reach out and we'll kind of find another mechanism. And no one reached out, right? So like clearly that was an example of something that was not useful for anyone in the room, myself included. Uh, but it took me I don't know if earlier in my career I'd have had the self what's the right word, sort of self-criticism or self-reflection to be able to say I'm going to cancel this meeting that in my head I think should be useful but like practically speaking isn't working.